The coaching session you're about to watch is a game analysis focused lesson that I had with a student of mine named Gary. And in this particular game we're going to be looking at, he played this game from a tournament that he participated in recently. And in this tournament, he gained close to 30 rating points. He jumped a little bit over the rating of 1700 USCF. And he also tied for first in this particular tournament. So he had a very nice result, which was great to see. During our previous lesson that we'd had together, we had analyzed an earlier round from this same tournament. And in that particular lesson, we had focused on situations where we might be able to trade one particular advantage for a different advantage in various positions. Mainly, we had focused on situations where we have the ability to potentially trade a bishop for a knight. And in the process, we might also be able to weaken our opponent's pawn structure at the same time. As you're going to see with this lesson in game analysis, though, we're going to be prioritizing a different topic, and that's going to be evaluating positions correctly, especially in the middle game and in-game phases during the game. Now, we'll also be focusing on positions where we're not entirely sure what our plan is, so kind of how to evaluate those situations. And also we evaluating positions where we might think we have a bit of a disadvantage, or maybe we think we're a bit worse off in the position. So as you'll see throughout the session, I'm going to give some good tips and advice on how to play these types of positions, and that you guys who are watching the video might also benefit from that. So without further ado, let's get right into the coaching session, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Okay, so just to recap real quick what we talked about during our previous lesson, we had primarily focused on reviewing one of your recent club games. In that particular game, we had this situation where you had the bishop pair for quite a long time in the game. We were talking about how to make use of that bishop pair, how to kind of create weaknesses in the opponent's position, which side of the board to play on, whether we can kind of target weaknesses, or if we can also try to play on the side of the board where we have the pawn majority or the space advantage. So really trying to figure out how to navigate that type of late middle game, in-game kind of phase that you were playing. And you ended up winning the game, which was nice to see. And so we have another one of your games to check out, but we also have a couple of homework positions that we will start off by looking at. So I'm just cutting in here to mention that I will not be sharing the homework positions during the video here. Mainly this is because I wanted to hold a couple of things back, especially personalized homework that's given to students. They do pay for these lessons. They do pay for this homework essentially. So they have to kind of, get something for themselves as they're paying for the lesson. You guys might be able to see this particular lesson here on YouTube, but the homework positions for them are going to be not shown in this particular video. If you are watching this video, though, and you would like to see the homework positions, or you would like to receive your own homework exercises, positions, and puzzles to solve on your own, then maybe comment below the video. Maybe I can work out something if enough people are interested in this. But without any more interruptions, let's get back to the lesson. All right, so let's get into your recent game. And we'll take a look at this. Also, congrats on the draw, which got you the share for first place in the tournament. So
yeah,
very nice job.
Yeah.
And yeah, let's jump right into it here. So let me copy it and put it on the board. All right. So you're playing white against Samuel Katagi.
Yeah.
You've played this guy before? I feel like I heard this name before.
Yes, I played him more USCF than I've played anybody. He was the one that got me to go to this club. He's a friend of mine.
Okay.
So there is a bit of a backstory to this in that I think I told you last week that the pairings come out a week in advance, and he and I shared second. There was a 2100 that was first. The 2100 pulls out on the day, and we got notified, I don't know, 20 minutes before I left the house that I was playing him, which was just enough time. And he always, against d4, he always plays this horrible, this stupid move, knight c6. I don't know why he does it. So I've had great results against it. And so I was like, well, I'm fine. And so I'm walking out the door, and I actually thought to myself, you know what? He could play d5, knight c6. I've got no idea. So I quickly rushed back, and I just quickly looked at a line, which is the worst thing I could have done, because it definitely didn't help me at all, and actually put me in some, I didn't get a good, as you know, I didn't do well in the opening. So it'd been better not to have seen it at all, which is because I was just looking at piece placement, and yeah, I'd make a mess of this opening.
Yeah, it's kind of a situation where sometimes a little bit of knowledge can be a bad thing.
Exactly.
It's kind of a potential situation like that. Also, if you're hearing banging in the background, and it's July 4th, so that's you're hearing fireworks. So my apologies for that.
I've got it to come. Don't worry.
Yeah, it'll come for you in a couple hours, most likely. um, but yeah, so yeah, it's a case where um, yeah, you have to just be a little bit careful sometimes, especially if it's very shortly before a game.
Yeah.
That you know, unless you're able to like 100% know exactly what he's gonna play, even if he does play knight c, even if you know he's gonna play knight c6 on move two, like if you'd almost want to like know for sure somehow what his like follow up would be, or how you can get like
Yeah.
maybe an exact position that you already know is like good for you or something like that. But um, yeah, it's a case where sometimes a little bit of preparation can almost be worse than none, because the little bit is not necessarily always sufficient to like make you comfortable in the opening, and
Yeah.
um, sometimes it's better to not you know
No.
have too much preparation going into it. Is it's a little bit backward sounding, but
No, it's right for sure.
kind of
Yeah.
depends on the situation, I suppose. So so we start with d4, d5, c4. He goes knight to c6. Um, I think the simplest way, or at least what I would personally lean towards here, um, is how do I put it here? I think a simple answer to this, it may not necessarily be like the computer's best option or top option or something like that, but I've always kind of been partial to simply taking the pawn on
Oh,
d5
really? Interesting.
and then playing either e3 or knight f3. I mean, black is definitely going to play e5 regardless of which of those two moves you play. Um, but I think I've at least had this type of position a few times. He goes e5, you go knight c3 to hit the queen. Pretty much black has to pin the knight. If he moves the queen, you can follow up with a d5, so he kind of has to do this. And then I think here I've played like bishop to d2, bishop takes. I think bishop takes. I'm trying to remember. It's actually been quite a while since I played against this, but I think it was something like this. Um, and it's supposed to be like objectively fine for black. The computer will give it like something close to zero advantage for either player. But I've always been relatively happy with the pair of bishops. You'll play like e3 and bishop c4. Usually, I would try to castle queenside in these situations, and maybe play like d5 if given the chance to open up the bishop on c3. I know there is one variation here where black can play pawn to e3, which is kind of like a sacrifice. He gives the pawn up, but he kind of weakens our king position. But even here, if I remember correctly, I think you can give the pawn back and then play e3 and still get the bishop out. And the idea is that you're gonna the main advantage here is you're just gonna have like a big space advantage with the d4 and e3 pawns kind of working together. You bring the bishop out, you play queen to c2 probably, you castle kingside or queenside, and I think white is doing fine in these situations. It's not I won't necessarily say it's like the way to punish this opening by any means. I'm sure there's better sequences, but this is at least one that I was always a little bit partial to in the past. Um, I do think the way that you play here is probably, uh, I think at least the starting off situations is perfectly fine. So knight f3. You also gave this option of knight c3, and then
Yeah.
here black might play knight f6. If he plays knight f6, then you can take, you can play e4, and you can get just a very pleasant position in the center. Before playing e4, I might even play like knight f3 first, just to kind of make e5 tougher for black to play. and then play e4 afterwards. So just as an example, like, I don't know, what does black play here? G6 or something like that. Now we go e4. We pretty much get the same position with e5 just being tougher for black to pull off here. Because now if he plays e5, I think you can play like d5 and then take the pawn with your knight once this knight moves. But maybe he would go bishop g7, and then you can play like just continue developing. And again, you just have more space in the center. So that's one possible way of doing things. It might be that black would take on c4 as you have in this variation, and then this kind of stuff is supposed to be generally a bit better for white. Again, it's primarily based on the fact that you have the space advantage. And yeah, so there's a number of ways to kind of play against it. Whatever you had prepared the little bit before the game, was it at like what point did you kind of start forgetting?
Yeah, knight c3, and then I think he took on c4, and I was like, oh. And of course, I think for whatever reason, I didn't play d5, which, looking at it afterwards strikes me as being obvious, but I didn't do it. So yeah, I forget what I looked at, but the idea was on the next move I took on d5.
Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, so it ends up that generally when they take the pawn, the d5 response is pretty good, especially if there's no pawn on e6 to kind of slow that down. If black wanted to take on c4, he probably should have played like e6 first. And then, then he can take without you being able to respond with pawn to d5, since he has the e-pawn to support that square. So, in the game, though, when he takes on c4 without the pawn on e6, then yeah, we can play d5 and start causing some havoc here, essentially. I mean, if he goes back to b8, in the very worst case scenario, we can always check with the queen and then pick up the pawn. Probably it's better to play, like, knight e5 or pawn to e4, followed by taking the pawn on c4. There's a number of ways we can kind of equalize the material with a pretty pleasant position. And if he tries to, like, take the knight first, take back with the pawn, as you have mentioned here, harass the knight a bit, get the pawn back. He can't take on f4 because of bishop b5 check, and black is already he's just in big trouble already at this point. Bishop pair, space advantage. The other problem here is how does he ever develop the bishop on f8? He would need to play g6, which he can't do, and he also can't really play e6 because we've got that square covered. So black is just going to have a hard time developing his king side at this point. So d5 is a nice option that's available here. I don't necessarily think e3 is like a bad move by any means, but d5 would be kind of like the better option at this point, essentially. So he strikes with e5. You go ahead and regain the pawn. Probably for him, he should just focus on developing. Seems a little risky to try to open up the center when he has no kingside development just yet. So we could still respond with d5, similar ideas to what we just looked at a second ago. Kick the knight, take the pawn, but I think taking on c4 is fine as well. The nice thing is here, it's not like he can take the knight followed by taking the pawn, because once we take with the queen on f3, we're threatening...
Knight, yeah.
We're threatening, the mate on f7 or something like that. So he develops the knight. You develop the bishop, keeping the pawn secure. Once again, if he takes the knight followed by taking the pawn, then we can take on b7 or something like that. So it tends to be that these little sequences for sequences. I don't know if that's how you say it. These sequences are not very good for black if they're trying to like get the pawn in the center of the board. It's just generally speaking risky to do that, especially when he's not castled yet. So you also have this move queen to b3 that you were considering, which does, avoid him. He can't take the knight because he'll get mated, but you did show this move check, and then he takes the knight, and this starts to get
Yeah, I didn't like this.
It's just kind of uncomfortable. At the very least, he can also go knight a5 and pick up our bishop right afterwards. And our pawn structure is not so good. Similar kind of to the homework positions, he's going to have way more weaknesses to go after than you are, and I think that you're okay, but it's not going to be super fun for white, I think, here.
Sure.
So I think bishop e3, as you played in the game, looks way simpler. You could also, because we know we're not really worried about this capture in most situations, you can also castle and try to use the open e file a bit quicker here, I think. If black, I don't know, let's say he tries to be greedy and do something like this. I think we check. We can maybe go after the pin knight, which is attacked a couple times. He can't castle because we'll take the knight followed by the bishop, which won't be defended. He probably has to come back like this to guard the knight or something. And we can just keep all the pressure up on black's position in something like this. That being said, he pretty much should not take the knight. He should just focus on developing.
Yeah.
And it very well may transpose to the game anyways, quite honestly. It might, something like this could easily occur. So, you start off with bishop e3, though. He makes the pin. You castle, and here you played bishop back to e2. You said you felt like you had to break the pin. You were hoping to play a move like knight to e5. So, I do agree that, if we can play knight e5, that's, going to be a generally good spot for the knight to hop to. I don't necessarily think we have to play bishop e2 in order to move our position forward. Like, what else could we do here? Like, maybe just some rook e1, rook c1, just kind of slow improvement moves potentially. I feel like I would like to keep the bishop on c4 if I can, mainly because it fights for control of the d5 square, but, it does become a little tricky to move this queen or this knight if we're constantly, this bishop pin or this bishop takes f3 is constantly kind of looming over our heads at this point. So I think bishop e2 is understandable. I do think we might be able to get away with something like this. And then, I don't know, rook e1, maybe g4, but it kind of strikes me as being very risky.
Yeah, feels risky.
I mean, you could do something like this if you really wanted the knight here, but yeah, it just feels a little unnecessarily shaky.
And I'm playing my opponent as well, and my opponent is one of those players. I mean, he's been playing his whole life, and he gives you chances. But if he smells blood, he's very good attacker. He's much stronger as an attacker than his rating would suggest. He just makes silly decisions from time to time. So I'm playing my opponent a little bit as well.
Probably don't want to give him a position where we're opening up the king too easily for him to potentially take advantage of.
I've lost games to him like that on many occasions. So.
Yeah, with that in mind, I think bishop e2 makes sense. It's not even necessarily like, even if h3 and g4 was good for white, I think it would just have too much, risk. There, you have to factor the risk versus reward kind of scenario in that case, and I think bishop e2 looks perfectly fine. So he develops, we develop. You said your plan was to play knight e5 and sack the pawn. You thought you'd get piece activity and probably regain the pawn. There were some lines where you could land a pawn on c7 and others where you got the g7 pawn. So...
It was a little faulty, though, I come to discover.
Yeah. So... Yeah, you mentioned this line knight e5, which doesn't work just yet because he's going to take it, trade stuff, win the pawn. We don't have really a ton of compensation at this point, and we're just down a pawn at this point. So rook c1 looks like a perfectly normal kind of developing move. And then you hop in with knight e5 afterwards. So yeah, I would be a little iffy on this, even if Like, if you have it calculated for sure, and you know that you're not going to lose a pawn, then that's one thing. Um, but I think we can also kind of play a bit more, I don't know, calmly, I suppose, is maybe a way of putting it, without needing to kind of
Yeah.
stir up a ton of complications. Like, maybe we could do, I don't know, let's say we start with h3, just a generally useful move. Probably he goes to h5. If he goes backwards, then, you know, then we have more options. But let's say he goes to h5, which is probably what I would expect him to do. Maybe somewhere in here you could also throw in some kind of queen b3 move, since you're not really worried about the knight anymore. If he's not careful, you might play d5 and then kick away the knight protecting the bishop. Also, you could play a3, and if the bishop moves, you take the b pawn, is a potential idea. Um, I mean, like, what would he do here? I don't know. This is, I think, our main threat. So maybe he guards the bishop with the queen. Um, Probably now we can go a3 and target the b pawn behind the bishop. So I think black kind of has to take on c3. If he moves away, I think we can get away with grabbing the pawn and hitting the knight in the process. So he probably needs to take the pawn, or take the knight. Here we have some options we could take with, the rook in order to keep the half-open c file. We could take with the pawn in order to support the center and kind of open up the b file more. I think both of them have their advantages. And then what we're left over with now is like the bishop pair, centralize the pieces, push in the center, hit the b pawn. Yeah, I think we're in,
Yeah.
perfectly fine shape here. So I think here a little bit when you played bishop e2, you were really trying to make knight to e5 work as a follow-up. And yeah, if we can make it work, I think it will be good. But the trouble is yeah, the calculation kind of just messes up here a
It's
little
off.
bit.
Yeah, I just I thought I calculated everything because I did spend quite a bit of time on it, but
Hmm.
there's certainly I missed one thing, and there was a second one as well where he could have gone about it a completely different way. Yeah, and I
Were
think I
you
regret.
anticipating that he would like take the bishop and you would be able to get the knight afterwards, for instance, or
No, this where are we?
yeah, this
This
is the
was
game
all.
scenario.
This was the game I'd actually the game I'd seen this. It was one of these other lines that where are we? Where are we? 95 d5 queen bishop. Yeah, it was move 13 where he takes on c3. This is the bit I missed. I saw it. Where is it? Yeah, there we go. So this I'd seen, and I just thought, okay, I play this. Hang on a minute. What was it? I took. He takes. I take rook e5. No, yeah, sorry. What was it? I assumed I would play this way. There, there. He can take at the end because I thought he had two pieces on pre here. And he doesn't because he can take the pawn with a bishop.
Right, yeah, he can come back with the
And
bishop.
that's the bit that on this line, that was the bit I missed. And he's just a pawn up.
Yeah, it just, I guess to my sight here, like let's say even before the move 95, um, it feels like everything in black's position is relatively well covered in terms of like each of the bishops are at least defended by a knight, and the e5 square is attacked 2 times. It feels like 95 is just a little bit of a stretch in this case. Like even without a ton of calculation, it feels like black is not necessarily better here, but black is pretty solid. Everything's
Yeah.
just well covered. So I think rather than trying to kind of like force the matter and create
Yeah.
uh, trouble out of thin air, so to speak. Um, I think at the end of the day, it's a little bit better here to kind of just play it a little
Yeah.
bit slow, keep improving the pieces, poke the bishop, maybe a3, kind of see what black decides to do. Um, maybe queen b3, d5, just work with what we've got to some degree.
Yeah.
Um, I will say that we're in a little bit of a unideal isolated queen pawn scenario
Yep.
because usually when you have the isolated queen pawn, you're trying to like attack the opponent's king in combination with it.
Yep.
Here it's a lot easier said than done because you know we just don't really have much stuff aiming at the king right now, and it's not that easy to organize it either without leaving the option of bishop takes knight on the table in some scenarios. Um, but yeah, I think 95 could
Yeah, I
get
think
us into a little bit of a tricky spot here.
it could have done. I think I was a little frustrated that the opening hadn't gone well at all. And as you say, I recognised that the IQP situation was about as bad as it could get because I wasn't going to be attacking anytime soon. So I thought that this would be the way out. And ironically, I did. It did work, but he just saw what I saw. So
hmm
I was just lucky. Well, I saw a bit more than he did actually, because I saw that I could take on G7.
hmm
But yeah, this was not a good way to play.
Yeah, if he hadn't played rook e8, like if he had done, I don't know, let's say like h6 here or something like that, and maybe now we can get 95 to
Yeah,
work, um, then I think it's fine because in this case we're not losing like a pawn or anything like that. If he takes here, we
yeah,
probably need to take with the knight to keep the d pawn supported, and if he keeps capturing, then we get rid of the isolated pawn, and I think we're doing, you know,
yeah,
relatively fine in this situation here. Um, we might still be left over with a slight weakness that we'll have to keep an eye on, but at least we're not down a pawn just yet. We can play like f4 to support it if necessary. Um, but yeah, here in the game we give him the option to win the pawn. Um, but as you well, like he could have, as you point out here, he could have maybe played bishop takes c3 and won the pawn without any counterplay. He plays into the sequence where you do get to win the pawn back, which is, in that regard, that part of things is definitely good calculation. The fact that you
yeah,
have maybe bishop takes g7 at the end of this. Um, Apparently, you mentioned that the computer brings out that you could take this way and then play something like knight
yeah.
to d5.
Computer had some. I mean, it was pretty impressive actually. I didn't see any of this.
Yeah, this the idea here, bishop takes g7 seems perfectly reasonable in the sense that you are guaranteed to get the pawn back essentially. Whereas, if you take on d1, I guess you're getting the pawn back here as well, but you have to recognize that like rook takes doesn't work due to knight d5, and if pawn takes, then there's just too many things
Yeah,
hanging at the same time. And yeah, this would probably, you know, for all intents and purposes, it maybe could still end up being a draw from here down the road. But if anybody's got winning chances, it's you for sure because of the pawn structure, better rooks, rook on the seventh rank, stuff like that, for instance. Um, but what ends up happening is you take g7, take back on d1. You said you had seen this combination up to here and evaluated you must be a little bit better because of the pawn structure. It is true
yeah.
that your pawn structure is a little bit better. But the tricky thing is that your knight is not going to be able to access any great squares going forward easily,
Yeah,
and the bishop is going to be a tad bit better than the knight, generally speaking, going forward.
yeah.
I don't think you're necessarily worse here. At least if you are, it's not by much. Um, in
I think
terms
I
of
convinced myself I did. That was the problem. I sort of convinced myself that I was. I wasn't like I was going to lose the game or anything, but I was like,
Mhm.
I'm going to be defending here. I think I wasn't. I was pleased until I got here, and when I got here, I didn't really like it very much.
Yeah, so let's say that we are unhappy with our position, or at least a little bit. Like you said, I don't think we would ever say that we're losing here, but we're maybe, not having the advantage we had kind of hoped or thought we were going to have just in this position. Um, what is your like drawing path from here? Like what kind of positions would you be working towards from here in order to try to draw the to get a draw result?
Well, I'd love to. Obviously, I'd love him to exchange the bishop for knight.
Right?
I'd love to swap off a pair of rooks. Um, Centralize my king. Uh, I mean, if I could get to the seventh rank, that would be great as well. But a lot of that isn't going to happen, right? So I think don't I in the game I sort of don't necessarily do it right. I actually try and trade a pair of rooks off. Well, I think that was a mistake. I don't think I needed to rush for that because I was worried about him getting the D file. I was obviously he can never enter on the E file, so I'm just going to play King F1.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, I think there is a line here, and it was what I was really worried about. He could actually enter on. I mean, it's just rook takes, rook d8, and he can. Yeah, I was really worried about that.
Yeah, and here if he gets to D2, it's going to be a bit uncomfortable for sure. You gave this variation where you do this, you go to E2, he takes this. Now our pawn structure is also a little bit messed up in the process, and the tricky thing with this particular position is going to be like you're going to have to start assessing king and pawn in games at this point,
Yeah.
and you both have a little bit of a messed up pawn structure. You kind of got almost like a mirror image. If you kind of like, draw a diagonal line down the board. Um, your A and C pawns are kind of like his H and F pawns in a sense. Um, the thing is, though, that I think in a scenario like this, um, the key difference is that your kings are both closer to the king side, and which means that his queen side
Yeah.
pawn majority is going to kind of pull you. He's going to be able to pull you a little bit further away, while he can like, um, I don't know, maybe beat you to the punch in the center, or cause a little bit of trouble in the.
I did think that actually. I was aware that I didn't want this to turn into a king and pawn endgame because for that very reason, I thought he might actually be able to win it.
Yeah, so we have to be a little bit careful in that regard. So I think here, um, like when I was going through this game, my first instinct was probably just to play King F1 here at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah,
Just keep the rook off E2. He'll probably double up. Maybe here I can now play. I'm trying to find ways to make Rook D7 work. I think Rook D7 doesn't work right now though, because he'll take the knight, and we can't take back with the rook due to the mate.
yeah.
So we'd have to take with the pawn. So we don't want to rush that necessarily. Um, maybe here, I don't know. Maybe I poke the bishop. If he takes on c3 in this case, now taking with the rook is fine since we have the e1 square covered. If he, I don't know, moves it away somewhere, we can maybe keep poking it. I don't know. Maybe poke it again, chase it again. If we can make this trade, as you said before, it's going to be pretty hard for black to beat us. With the pure, two rook versus two rook in game. I don't know. Other ways he could try to retreat to avoid getting attacked. Maybe he has to come back to like d6 or something. Maybe here I play g3 or h3 just to avoid losing my h-pawn at any point. I'm not sure if one of these is much better than the other. g3 kind of keeps it on a dark square, which makes it a potential weakness, but it also does blunt the bishop at the same time, so there's kind of pros and cons to that. Whereas h3 kind of just gets it off a dark square completely. Probably both are okay. And, maybe from here I would like double on the d file, hope the bishop moves, try to invade to d7. If he wants to offer a trade of rooks, I'll exchange at least one pair of rooks without a problem. You probably do want to avoid trading all of the rooks because the bishop versus knight endgame is going to be at least a little bit tricky for you.
Yeah.
It might still be a draw or drawish, but the bishop is generally going to outperform the knight, especially in combination with the queenside pawn majority. But I don't think there'd be a problem with trading like one pair of rooks, for instance. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know, what does black do here? Maybe f5, and maybe I go to double, and I don't know, maybe he like walks the king a little bit further up the board. We hit the bishop, moves away. Probably don't want to let him mess our pawns up. But even then, once again, it's going to still be like the two rooks versus two rooks, which is probably hard for him to win. Maybe this. Probably move the pawns off the dark squares at some point. Invade the 7th rank. Go knight d4. Yeah, we can make like small improvements, and I don't think we're necessarily going to win the position, but I think it's also going to be very hard for him to win the position
Yeah.
at the same time here. Um, with rook to e1, the reason we have to be careful with this particular move is kind of almost like the reverse of the homework positions, right? Where now it's black who has the ability to create a weakness for ourselves by trading the rooks, then taking on c3, or playing rook d8 first or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I liked.
He could also do it this way, where we would love to play rook e7, but our back rank is a little bit too weak, and he's going to kind of beat us to the punch, getting on our second rank. And again, we'd always have to assess, like, do we want to trade the rooks? Do we want to go to the rook in game? Or, sorry, the king and pawn in game? You know, it just is just becoming trickier for us in this particular case. So I do think, generally speaking, trying to trade a pair of rooks is fine. It just ends up in this specific spot. He can trade and weaken our pawns in the in combination, which makes it maybe a little bit less ideal. If our king was already on f1, just for instance, let's say he made some just random move, now I think rook e1 would be fine, because if he takes, you could take with the king.
Yep.
It's still a little bit awkward due to the pin, but at least your pawn's not getting you're not getting isolated or anything like that. And maybe, I don't know, I might even go back to f1 just to avoid d-file stuff. Move the knight next move. If he goes here to try to go to d2, I might just, keep him out. Move the knight at some point, hit the bishop. Once again, probably hard for black to, make too much progress from a position like this. But I would say the key in the first place to playing a position like this is making sure that our evaluation of it is accurate in the first place. Because if we think we're worse off, or we feel like we're in trouble, or we feel like we're losing, or whatever, however far along the spectrum of disadvantage we think we're at, it can definitely affect how we play the position. And if we think that we're like much worse off than we actually are, just for example, we might start to feel a bit like desperate to some degree. Yeah. We might feel like, oh, I feel like I'm losing this position. I need to do something to stir up trouble. I need to, if I play calmly, he's just going to crush me. Whatever it might be in terms of how we extrapolate our thoughts of the position. Whereas if we're able to evaluate the position and say, okay, I feel like I'm maybe a little bit worse off, but it's not the end of the world. I feel like if I kind of just hold steady, I should be okay, as long as when you're having a disadvantage, usually one of the main things you want to do is you want to try to obviously improve your own position, but while you're improving your own position, you want to try to not let your opponent turn the game or get some kind of advantage from the position along the way. I don't know if I showed you these games or not. I had two specific games that happened from my recent... no, I don't think I did. I played an International Master Norm event maybe about 3 weeks ago or something like that.
I remember that. Yep.
Okay, so there was two specific games in that tournament, which I don't think I did show you, but I think it was my second round game, and then my 8th round game against a GM. And I was having a disadvantage pretty much in both positions. And I will say that I ended up losing both, but they're for kind of different reasons. But in those particular games, it was important for me to assess or evaluate the position objectively, rather than thinking oh, it looks like I'm in terrible shape. I need to do something crazy to get myself back in the game. In both of those games, it actually ended up being that I wasn't maybe as worse off as it might have seemed at first, and playing it, just playing it calmly, and the defense calmly would be perfectly fine. Whereas if I tried to like stir up too much trouble, I would easily shoot myself in the foot and make it hard for myself. Um, so yeah, maybe that's something we'll talk a little bit more about, like evaluating positions, but especially like in-game positions where it might seem like our opponent's having some kind of advantage that we would maybe not be happy with, but it may not necessarily be as bad as we think in the first place. Um, a little bit of that comes down to our mentality as well. Like if we got a little bit flustered by something earlier in the game, or maybe they made a move we hadn't been ready for, or it could be very easy for us to start saying like, oh, I completely missed that. How could I miss that?
Yeah.
I'm worse off now. I'm, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas like if you take a step back and view the position objectively, you could easily say like, okay, it's not as bad as it looks, kind of situation. I think that's kind of what's going on here, maybe a little bit. So I do think that trading a pair of rooks with Rookie 1 is a good idea. It just ends up that he could have weakened our pawns in the process. When he plays Rookie 8, like you said, we're pretty happy to see this. We get to trade. King F1. He plays Bishop A5. Here, I think we can get away with Rook D1 as you have in the notes here, primarily because he's not able to get on the second rank. That's kind of the big difference with this scenario versus like the scenario that we were looking at earlier. That being said, I think that the move F3 that you played in the game seems okay. You can kind of put the knight on E4, for example. He tries to keep the knight blocked out. Now you play Rook to D1, threatening the check. He guards the 7th rank. You maneuver the knight around a little bit. Make sure there's no pawns on dark squares. He gives a check. You go back, and yeah, you're kind of, if he wants to keep repeating the position, I think we're fine with the draw given the circumstance.
Yeah.
So C5 from him kind of feels like he's trying to win, but it is weakening this D5 square in the process, and if we can get a knight to D5, that can at least be, somewhat annoying for him. So you start off with B3. He plays Rook E6. Now you go Knight C3, for, threatening the fork. He goes here. You check here. Now you play pawn to F4. Rook E1 would be a nice pin, but Bishop G3, as you pointed out, would lose us materials, so we definitely don't want to do that. So we hit the bishop. He checks. We move up. He moves the king back, and yeah, now we go G4. Now this is a little bit reminiscent of the game from last week we looked at, where now we're using the pawn majority finally, and now we're actually starting to make some progress in the position. Essentially,
I was feeling good about now.
Yeah, so this is looking good here at this point. He hits the pawn. You went pawn to A4. You said the computer likes to move Rook to D2 a little bit more. The reason it's going to prefer that, I think, is because the more you move the pawns forward, especially on the side of the board where he's better, it makes it a little bit easier for him to get pawn breaks, essentially. Like, with pawn to A4, you also have to contend a little bit with, like, pawn to C4 at some point. He can't do it now, of course, because you'll take the bishop. But he might be able to play pawn to C4 to kind of, like, break apart your pawns. I don't know. Like, if he does, let's say, did something like this, just for instance. Let's say you push, just for example. He could maybe throw in, like, a C4 move and try to, like, get some counterplay on the queen side or something like that. Whereas if you play Rook to D2, like, he can't, C4 will just lose a pawn in this case. Or, well, of course, the bishop, but, down the road it might, lose a pawn if he doesn't have an A4 pawn to take on top of it. So, I think your position is still better here, though. He hits knight, you move backwards, he trades, goes here, and now you have a B3 pawn you have to be careful about. You played Rook to D3. He played Rook to C6. He offered a draw here. You're both down to 5 minutes, and he's the much better blitz player. You thought you were a little bit better here, but took the draw as it was the final round and gave you a share of first. Yeah, it ends up that you're a bit better off here. He should have definitely traded bishop for knight to get into this rook in game, where then it is, most likely a draw. Whereas if he keeps if he allows you to keep the knight on the board, you can definitely stir up sufficient trouble for him in this position. And So yeah, I think this is a case where you can kind of keep pressing for with your advantage here. Um, Obviously, in the sense of the tournament scenario, where if you guys draw, you get a tie for first. I mean, it's hard to fault you in that kind of scenario.
Yeah,
Um, I think maybe in other scenarios, I'd probably encourage you to kind of keep going in this position to try to
yeah,
convert the advantage that you have here into a win versus just kind of bailing out with a draw. Um, but of course, you kind of have to once again weigh the risk versus reward, especially in the scenario of the tournament. Um, and also, like you said, he's a better blitz
it
player, for
is. Yeah,
instance. Um, so there's a couple of things to weigh there. I do think though that generally speaking, if you have the advantage, you just have to be a little careful that you don't default to worrying about like external things too much at the cost of like if you know that you're better in the position, you should kind of be trying to win the position
yeah,
ideally at the end of the
yeah.
day. um, but that's more of like a learning thing versus like in the moment if you're taking a draw and like tying for first, it's kind of hard to like it's kind of hard to fault you.
Yeah,
What
I
what
know.
I might encourage is maybe taking this position and playing it out against the computer a little
I,
bit just to
I
um,
did actually.
okay.
We played it out of the club. There was a whole bunch of people watching, so they were
Hmm.
chipping in. But actually, he would have played better than I think he was kind of tired like I was. But he would have lost it if he played the way he did. He would just pieces quickly.
Hmm.
I actually did it against the computer today, and I can't believe this. I put the computer on 2500. I played 9F5.
Hmm.
The computers move, and now admittedly I gave it 5 minutes. I gave us both 5 minutes. The computers move. First go round was that.
On the 2500 rating.
I think I need to change my computer to all. I swear to God.
That's a very friendly 2500 rated computer.
Yeah, I know. I was jaw was on the floor.
Yeah, I don't know how their algorithm for blunders works. Like I think in a perfect world, a computer is going to like let's say a 2500 computer versus like a 1500 rated computer. In a
Yeah,
perfect world, the 2500 computer is going to make like uh I don't know how else to say it, but like they're going to make 2500 level moves, whereas the
yeah,
1500 computers can make 1500 rated level moves. But with computers, it's just I don't know how their coding works, but I got to
yeah.
imagine to some degree it's tough to like tell the difference between a 1500 move and a 2500 move because computers are just looking for the best move, generally speaking. Um,
Yeah.
and then they'll just randomly throw in some big blunders every now and then. Uh, it's like
Yeah.
it'll play like Magnus Carlsen for 49 moves and then throw you some 50th move blunder out of nowhere. And
Yeah.
as long as you catch the blunder, then you beat the computer in a lot of those
Yeah.
scenarios. But yeah, I the fact that it throws Bishop G7 first move, that would be a very I would love to play this 2500 rated computer all day long and
Well, I try. No, I mean normally I get crushed, but I have no idea what it was thinking.
I'm not
No,
entirely sure either. But okay, so you did play it out against the computer a little
I
bit at
did the
least.
second
So
time and drew it. Actually, I put a couple. I
mhm,
put, I put I forget what I put in. I didn't let it make the blunder again. I
right.
played a couple of moves for black, and we played
Hmm.
it out from there, and it was a draw. So
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, it very well could still be a fairly equal position. Um, but especially if you're playing against a human and you're both in some slight time trouble, you probably could press here a little bit. But again, given the circumstance of the
yeah,
tournament, hard to complain about a draw in that kind of
yeah,
situation. Um, but yeah, so I think in this game, aside from the opening, which is a bit of an oddball opening, I will say he kind of made some mistakes here where you could punish him a bit more heavily in the opening. But aside from the opening phase, the I guess generally speaking, you want to be a little bit careful about overplaying your hand, so to speak. When
yeah,
it's not like your position is bad here by any means, and you don't
yeah,
necessarily need to force the matter to do something crazy or
yeah,
complicated or something like that. You can kind of just keep playing solid moves here and keep improving the position. With that being said, the calculation you had here in order to win the pawn back was good. And then I think probably the main thing from this particular game that will work a little bit more on going forward is evaluating, positions objectively in terms of like if we have, especially if we have a little bit of a worse position, trying to know like, okay, is it a little bit worse? Is it a lot worse? Am I just lost? Or am I, uncomfortable but definitely able to hang in there? There's kind of a big difference between all of those evaluations. And that'll help us, okay, if I do get into a tricky-ish position, maybe I can kind of keep my cool a little bit more and not get my, cause trouble for myself versus if I am just in a very bad position, sometimes in those types of situations, you do just have to try some trick or something like that. If the computer says you're like -5 and you're just like down a piece, you got to just try something and hope it works to some degree. Whereas if you're only like -0.5, you don't want to go like out of your way to do something ridiculously crazy and drop it to like -2 or something all of a sudden. So we'll talk a bit more about that probably with the next lesson going forward. So we'll get back together next Monday evening. And do you have another game coming up?
Yes, another one, first round tomorrow.
Okay, great. So we'll have another game to check out next week. I'll send a couple positions for homework before we get back together, and we'll look at the homework, go over the next game, and talk again next Monday evening then.
Brilliant.
Okay?
Thanks, Dalton.
All right, very welcome, Gary. Have a good rest of the night then.
You too. Cheers.
All right. First of all, I want to say congratulations to Gary for his great result in the tournament where he tied for first place and got a nice rating bump. So very nice job, Gary. And as you heard at the end of the lesson, the next topic that him and I are going to be working on is going to be based on this game analysis. And it's going to be focusing on improving at evaluating positions, especially ones where we look like we might have a bit of a disadvantage. I'll be sending him some homework positions to work on and check out on his own that are going to focus on this topic. And we'll be reviewing that homework and focusing on new things during the next lesson. Now for those of you who are watching this video, I am trying out this new content method of uploading full coaching sessions, but I'm not really sure how many people are actually interested in watching videos of this length. So if you did find this kind of content informational and you enjoyed it, then I would really appreciate if you would let me know in the comment below the video. You can also click the like button and subscribe to the channel. That would help me out a lot with the YouTube algorithm so that we can get this video out to more people so that it can reach a wider audience. And I do plan on uploading coaching sessions like this with various students on a semi-regular basis, assuming that people do find these videos interesting. I'm already teaching these lessons with students anyways, so I figured why not share some of them with the YouTube audience, especially lessons that I think are educational or beneficial for a wide variety of people and a wide level of players. So if you would like to get a coaching session yourself, then you can check out my website, nextlevelchesscoaching.com, and you can contact me through there. The links are going to be in the video description below. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully you found it interesting and insightful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around in a future video.